Section 12 of Manners, Customs and Dress. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ruth Golding. Manners, Customs and Dress during the Middle Ages and during the Renaissance period by Paul Lacroix. Section 12. Beverages. Beer is not only one of the oldest fermenting beverages used by man, but it is also the one which was most in vogue in the Middle Ages. If we refer to the tales of the Greek historians, we find that the Gauls, who, like the Egyptians, attributed the discovery of this refreshing drink to their god Osiris, had two sorts of beer, one called zythus, made with honey and intended for the rich, the other called korma, in which there was no honey, and which was made for the poor. But Pliny asserts that beer in Gallia was called cerevisia, and the grain employed for making it brasce. This testimony seems true, as from brasce or brasse comes the name brasseur, brewer, and from cerevisia, cervoise, the generic name by which beer was known for centuries, and which only lately fell into disuse. Domitian ordered all the vines in Gaul to be uprooted so as to make room for corn. This rigorous measure must have caused beer to become even more general, and although 2 centuries later Probus allowed vines to be replanted, the use of beverages made from grain became an established custom. But in time, whilst the people still only drank cervoise, those who were able to afford it bought wine and drank it alternately with beer. However, as by degrees the vineyards increased, in all places having a suitable soil and climate, the use of beer was almost entirely given up, so that in central Gaul wine became so common and cheap that all could drink it. In the northern provinces, where the vine would not grow, beer naturally continued to be the national beverage. In the time of Charlemagne, for instance, we find the emperor wisely ordered that persons knowing how to brew should be attached to each of his farms. Everywhere the monastic houses possessed breweries, but as early as the reign of Saint Louis there were only a very few breweries in Paris itself, and in spite of all the privileges granted to their corporation, even these were soon obliged to leave the capital, where there ceased to be any demand for the produce of their industry. They reappeared in 1428, probably in consequence of the political and commercial relations which had become established between Paris and the rich towns of the Flemish bourgeoisie, and then, either on account of the dearness of wine or the caprice of fashion, the consumption of beer again became so general in France that, according to the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, it produced to the revenue 2/3 more than wine. It must be understood, however, that in times of scarcity, as in the years 1415 and 1482, brewing was temporarily stopped, and even forbidden altogether, on account of the quantity of grain which was thereby withdrawn from the food supply of the people. Under the Romans, the real cervoise, or beer, was made with barley; but at a later period all sorts of grain was indiscriminately used, and it was only towards the end of the 16th century that adding the flour or seed of hops to the oats or barley, which formed the basis of this beverage, was thought of. Estienne Boileau's Book of Trades, edited in the 13th century, shows us that, besides the cervoise, another sort of beer was known, which was called godale. This name, we should imagine, was derived from the 2 German words God ale, which mean good beer, and was of a stronger description than the ordinary cervoise. This idea is proved by the Picards and the Flemish people calling it double beer. In any case, it is from the word godale that the familiar expression of godailler, to tipple, is derived. In fact, there is hardly any sort of mixture or ingredient which has not been used in the making of beer, according to the fashions of the different periods. When, on the return from the Crusades, the use of spice had become the fashion, beverages as well as the food were loaded with it. Allspice, juniper, resin, apples, breadcrumbs, sage, lavender, gentian, cinnamon, and laurel were each thrown into it. The English sugared it, and the Germans salted it, and at times they even went so far as to put darnel into it, at the risk of rendering the mixture poisonous. The object of these various mixtures was naturally to obtain high-flavoured beers, which became so much in fashion that to describe the want of merit of persons, or the lack of value in anything, no simile was more common than to compare them to small beer. Nevertheless, more delicate and less blunted palates were to be found which could appreciate beer sweetened simply with honey, or scented with ambergris or raspberries. It is possible, however, that these compositions refer to mixtures in which beer, the produce of fermented grain, was confounded with hydromel or fermented honey. Both these primitive drinks claim an origin equally remote, which is buried in the most distant periods of history, and they have been used in all parts of the world, being mentioned in the oldest historical records, in the Bible, the Edda, and in the sacred books of India. In the 13th century, hydromel, which then bore the name of borgerafre, borgerast, or bochet, was composed of 1 part of honey to 12 parts of water, scented with herbs, and allowed to ferment for a month or 6 weeks. This beverage, which in the customs and statutes of the order of Cluny is termed potus dulcissimus, the sweetest beverage, and which must have been both agreeable in taste and smell, was specially appreciated by the monks, who feasted on it on the great anniversaries of the Church. Besides this, an inferior quality of bochet was made for the consumption of the lower orders and peasants, out of the honeycomb after the honey had been drained away, or with the scum which rose during the fermentation of the better qualities. Cider, in Latin sicera, and perry can also both claim a very ancient origin, since they are mentioned by Pliny. It does not appear, however, that the Gauls were acquainted with them. The first historical mention of them is made with reference to a repast which Thierry II., King of Burgundy and Orleans, 596 to 613, son of Childebert and grandson of Queen Bruno, gave to Saint Colomban, in which both cider and wine were used. In the 13th century, a Latin poet, Guillaume le Breton, says that the inhabitants of the Auge and of Normandy made cider their daily drink, but it is not likely that this beverage was sent away from the localities where it was made. For besides the fact that the Ménagier only very curtly mentions a drink made of apples, we know that in the 15th century the Parisians were satisfied with pouring water on apples and steeping them, so as to extract a sort of half-sour, half-sweet drink called des panses. Besides this, Paulmier de Grandmesnil, a Norman by birth, a famous doctor, and the author of a Latin treatise on wine and cider, 1588, asserts that half a century before, cider was very scarce at Rouen, and that in all the districts of Caux the people only drank beer. Du Perron adds that the Normans brought cider from Biscay when their crops of apples failed. By whom and at what period the vine was naturalized in Gaul has been a long disputed question, which, in spite of the most careful research, remains unsolved. The most plausible opinion is that which attributes the honour of having imported the vine to the Phoenician colony who founded Marseilles. Pliny makes mention of several wines of the Gauls as being highly esteemed. He nevertheless reproaches the vine growers of Marseilles, Beziers, and Narbonne with doctoring their wines, and with infusing various drugs into them, which rendered them disagreeable and even unwholesome. Dioscorides, however, approved of the custom in use among the Allobroges of mixing resin with their wines to preserve them and prevent them from turning sour, as the temperature of their country was not warm enough thoroughly to ripen the grape. Rooted up by order of Domitian in 92, as stated above, the vine only reappeared in Gaul under Protus, who revoked in 282 the imperial edict of his predecessor, after which period the Gallic wines soon recovered their ancient celebrity. Under the dominion of the Franks, who held wine in great favour, vineyard property was one of those which the barbaric laws protected with the greatest care. We find in the code of the Salians, and in that of the Visigoths, very severe penalties for uprooting a vine or stealing a bunch of grapes. The cultivation of the vine became general, and kings themselves planted them even in the gardens of their city palaces. In 1160 there was still in Paris, near the Louvre, a vineyard of such an extent that Louis VII. Could annually present 6 hogsheads of wine made from it to the rector of St. Nicholas. Philip Augustus possessed about 20 vineyards of excellent quality in various parts of his kingdom. The culture of the vine having thus developed, the wine trade acquired an enormous importance in France. Gascony, Aunis, and Saintonge sent their wines to Flanders. Guyenne sent hers to England. Froissart writes that in 1372 a merchant fleet of quite 200 sail came from London to Bordeaux for wine. This flourishing trade received a severe blow in the 16th century, for an awful famine having invaded France in 1566, Charles IX. Did not hesitate to repeat the acts of Domitian, and to order all the vines to be uprooted and their place to be sown with corn. Fortunately, Henry III. Soon after modified this edict by simply recommending the governors of the provinces to see that "the ploughs were not being neglected in their districts on account of the excessive cultivation of the vine." Although the trade of a wine merchant is one of the oldest established in Paris, it does not follow that the retail sale of wine was exclusively carried on by special tradesmen. On the contrary, for a long time the owner of the vineyard retailed the wine which he had not been able to sell in the cask. A broom, a laurel wreath, or some other sign of the sort hung over a door, denoted that any one passing could purchase or drink wine within. When the wine growers did not have the quality and price of their wine announced in the village or town by the public crier, they placed a man before the door of their cellar, who enticed the public to enter and taste the new wines. Other proprietors, instead of selling for people to take away in their own vessels, established a tavern in some room of their house, where they retailed drink. The monks, who made wine extensively, also opened these taverns in the monasteries, as they only consumed part of their wine themselves, and this system was universally adopted by wine growers, and even by the king and the nobles. The latter, however, had this advantage, that whilst they were retailing their wines, no one in the district was allowed to enter into competition with them. This prescriptive right, which was called droit de bon vin, was still in force in the 17th century. St. Louis granted special statutes to the wine merchants in 1264, but it was only 3 centuries later that they formed a society, which was divided into 4 classes, namely, hotel keepers, public house keepers, tavern proprietors, and dealers in wine à pot, that is, sold to people to take away with them. Hotel keepers, also called aubergistes, accommodated travellers, and also put up horses and carriages. The dealers à pot sold wine which could not be drunk on their premises. There was generally a sort of window in their door through which the empty pot was passed, to be returned filled. Hence the expression, still in use in the 18th century, vente à huit coupés, sail through a cut door. Public housekeepers supplied drink as well as nappe et assiette, tablecloth and plate, which meant that refreshments were also served. And lastly, the taverniers sold wine to be drunk on the premises, but without the right of supplying bread or meat to their customers. The wines of France in most request from the 9th to the 13th centuries were those of Mâcon, Cahors, Reims, Choisy, Montargis, Marne, Meulan, and Orléanais. Amongst the latter there was one which was much appreciated by Henry I, and of which he kept a store to stimulate his courage when he joined his army. The little fable of the Battle of Wines, composed in the 13th century by Henri d'Andely, mentions a number of wines which have to this day maintained their reputation. For instance, the Beaune in Burgundy, the Saint-Emilion in Gruyenne, the Chablis, Épernay, Cézanne in Champagne, etc. But he places above all, with good reason, according to the taste of those days, the Saint-Pourçain of Auvergne, which was then most expensive and in great request. Another French poet, in describing the luxurious habits of a young man of fashion, says that he drank nothing but Saint-Pourçain; and in a poem composed by Jean Brouillan, secretary of the Châtelet of Paris in 1332, we find Du Saint-Pourçain que l'on met en son Saint-Pourçain. Saint-Pourçain wine, which you imbibe for the good of your health. Towards 1400, the vineyards of Ailly became celebrated for Champagne as those of Beaune were for Burgundy, and it is then that we find, according to the testimony of the learned Pommier de Grandmesnil, kings and queens making champagne their favourite beverage. Tradition has it that Francis I., Charles Quint, Henry VIII., and Pope Leon X. all possessed vineyards in Champagne at the same time. Burgundy, that pure and pleasant wine, was not despised, and it was in its honour that Erasmus said, "Happy province, she may well call herself the mother of men, since she produces such milk." Nevertheless, the above-mentioned physician, Pommier, preferred to Burgundy, "if not perhaps for their flavour, yet for their wholesomeness, the vines of the Ile-de-France or vin français," which agree, he says, with scholars, invalids, the bourgeois, and all other persons who do not devote themselves to manual labour; for they do not parch the blood, like the wines of Gascony, nor fly to the head, like those of Orléans and Château Thierry, nor do they cause obstructions like those of Bordeaux. This is also the opinion of Bacchius, who in his Latin treatise on the natural history of wines, 1596, asserts that the wines of Paris "are in no way inferior to those of any other district of the kingdom." These thin and sour wines, so much esteemed in the first periods of monarchy and so long abandoned, first lost favour in the reign of Francis I., who preferred the strong and stimulating productions of the south. Notwithstanding the great number of excellent wines made in their own country, the French imported from other lands. In the 13th century, in the Battle of Wines, we find those of Argila, Spain, and above all those of Cyprus, spoken of in high terms. A century later, Eustace Deschamps praised the Rhine wines, and those of Greece, Malmsey, and Grenache. In an edict of Charles VI. Mention is also made of the muscatel, rosette, and the wine of Lieppe. Generally, the Malmsey which was drunk in France was an artificial preparation which had neither the colour nor taste of the Cyprian wine. Olivier de Serres tells us that in his time it was made with water, honey, clary juice, beer grounds, and brandy. At first the same name was used for the natural wine, mulled and spiced, which was produced in the island of Madeira from the grapes which the Portuguese brought there from Cyprus in 1420. The reputation which this wine acquired in Europe induced Francis I. to import some vines from Greece, and he planted 50 acres with them near Fontainebleau. It was at first considered that this plant was succeeding so well that there were hopes, says Olivier de Serres, that France would soon be able to furnish her own Malmsey and Greek wines, instead of having to import them from abroad. It is evident, however, that they soon gave up this delusion, and that for want of the genuine wine they returned to artificial beverages, such as vin cuit, or cooked wine, which had at all times been cleverly prepared by boiling down new wine and adding various aromatic herbs to it. Many wines were made under the name of herbés, which were merely infusions of wormwood, myrtle, hyssop, rosemary, etc., mixed with sweetened wine and flavoured with honey. The most celebrated of these beverages bore the pretentious name of nectar. Those composed of spices, Asiatic aromatics, and honey were generally called white wine, a name indiscriminately applied to liquors having for their bases some slightly coloured wine, as well as to the hypocras, which was often composed of a mixture of foreign liqueurs. This hypocras plays a prominent part in the romances of chivalry, and was considered a drink of honour, being always offered to kings, princes, and nobles on their solemn entry into a town. The name of wine was also given to drinks composed of the juices of certain fruits, and in which grapes were in no way used. These were the cherry, the currant, the raspberry, and the pomegranate wines; also the moré, made with the mulberry, which was so extolled by the poets of the 13th century. We must also mention the sour wines, which were made by pouring water on the refuse grapes after the wine had been extracted; also the drinks made from filberts, milk of almonds, the syrups of apricots and strawberries, and cherry and raspberry waters, all of which were refreshing and were principally used in summer; and lastly tisane, sold by the confectioners of Paris, and made hot or cold with prepared barley, dried grapes, plums, dates, gum, or licorice. This tisane may be considered as the origin of that drink which is now sold to the poor at a sou a glass, and which most assuredly has not much improved since olden times. It was about the 13th century that brandy first became known in France, but it does not appear that it was recognised as a liqueur before the 16th. The celebrated physician Arnaud de Villeneuve, who wrote at the end of the 13th century, to whom credit has wrongly been given for inventing brandy, employed it as one of his remedies, and thus expresses himself about it: "Who would have believed that we could have derived from wine a liquor which neither resembles it in nature, colour, or effect? This eau de vin is called by some eau de vie, and justly so, since it prolongs life. It prolongs health, dissipates superfluous matters, revives the spirits, and preserves youth. Alone, or added to some other proper remedy, it cures colic, dropsy, paralysis, ague, gravel, etc." At a period when so many doctors, alchemists, and other learned men made it their principal occupation to try to discover that marvellous golden fluid which was to free the human race of all its original infirmities, the discovery of such an elixir could not fail to attract the attention of all such manufacturers of panaceas. It was, therefore, under the name of eau d'or (aqua auri) that brandy first became known to the world, a name improperly given to it, implying as it did that it was of mineral origin, whereas its beautiful golden colour was caused by the addition of spices. At a later period, when it lost its repute as a medicine, They actually sprinkled it with pure gold leaves, and at the same time that it ceased to be exclusively considered as a remedy, it became a favourite beverage. It was also employed in distilleries, especially as the basis of various strengthening and exciting liqueurs, most of which have descended to us, some coming from monasteries and others from châteaux, where they had been manufactured. Section 13.